Programming is supported by The Object, a new podcast from the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Stories of artists told with style and wit. You can find The Object wherever you listen to podcasts. Programming is supported by Great River Energy, providing reliable electric service to 28 Minnesota member co-ops with a diverse mix of power generation, including power plants and renewable energy. Great River Energy, powering what's possible.
You're listening to a recording of a live radio show on MPR News. If you want to listen to us in real time, you can stream our show live weekdays at 9 a.m. Central. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show.
I'm Carrie Miller. This is MPR News. Now, why there's so much to learn about PTSD in women. The first thing to understand is that PTSD is not just about combat veterans. Researchers know that PTSD can be the consequence of a shocking, frightening, or traumatic event. Think sexual abuse or domestic violence or being threatened with a weapon. Today, a conversation about why women can be particularly vulnerable to PTSD and some of the ways to know if someone in your life is experiencing this. As our guests join us, I'm interested in whether if, as a woman, you or a daughter, sister, mother, someone in your family has experienced post-traumatic stress disorder, were you able to get help? What has worked? So researchers do not do as much research on women and PTSD. Your own personal experience or your familial experience will be very important to the conversation today. So if you, a sister, mother, daughter, someone in your family has experienced post-traumatic stress disorder, I hope you have a moment to call in and join the conversation. What has worked? What helps? 651-227-6000, 800-242-2828. You can reach me on Twitter at CarrieMPR. Dr. Colleen Cira is with us, a psychologist and the founder of the Cira Center for Behavioral Health in Chicago, and she's with us from Oak Park, Illinois. Dr. Cira, welcome. It's good to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
Dr. Danielle Johnson is with us, Chief of Adult Psychiatry at the Lindner Center of Hope outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. And she's with us from Mason, Ohio. And Dr. Johnson, welcome to you. Good to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Johnson, I assume you weren't affected by the tornadoes that came through Ohio. Wow, the news out of there is really something today. You're safe and everything's okay.
Yes. Thankfully, yes.
Good. And Danielle and Colleen, I hope you're okay with first names as we go on here. Is that good?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Danielle, as with cardiology for so long, has most of the research and the focus about PTSD been on men because for so long we associated it with combat trauma? Why don't researchers know as much as they should about what this means for women?
Absolutely. It's been focused on men, and I think that's in most areas of research. Historically, research has been focused on Caucasian men. As time has elapsed, research in other areas, whether it be behavioral health or medical issues, has included women and people of color. But it's still, at least for civilians, a lot of people don't recognize that PTSD can happen in people who have not been to war. Most of the research has been done in soldiers and veterans, and now that there is more of an understanding that it can happen in women, and it can happen in various types of trauma, women are more included in the research because they are a very large part of the population that has PTSD. But definitely the research needs to catch up to men.
Yeah, Colleen, is it fair to say you think that our image and understanding of PTSD has for a long time been kind of one-dimensional? You go to war, you're in combat, you may be susceptible to PTSD, and a lot of the other trauma that influences PTSD just wasn't well understood, particularly in women.
Yes, absolutely. And I think especially, so we're now starting to catch up a little bit with this idea that sexual assault can cause PTSD. That something really violent, a one-time really violent incident can cause PTSD, even like car accidents, natural disasters like these tornadoes happening. we're starting to understand that those things can cause PTSD, but we're really behind there. And we're really, really behind on this idea that it doesn't have to be a one-time incident, that little things that happen over a long course of time, those things cause PTSD as well. Things like racism can cause PTSD in people. So, there's so much work to do in terms of educating folks about all the different causes of trauma and PTSD, and we're quite behind in that regard, especially as it relates to experiences that women or marginalized individuals have.
This is interesting. So it's almost as if the layering of experiencing a situation again and again, even if the incident by itself might not be traumatic, it's the layering of having that experience again and again can create a PTSD syndrome, yeah?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. And I think your phrasing of that is absolutely perfect. The layering of experiences in addition to the different layers of someone's identity can all contribute to whether somebody develops PTSD or not. And the more marginalized or oppressed that person is, and especially with multiple identities, specifically a woman of color, the more susceptible, the less resources she's likely to have, so it becomes a really complicated problem.
Let me take a call here from Jane in Roseville. Hi, Jane. It sounds like you had a frightening and traumatic event. What happened?
I was on a bus in Mexico, and it was hijacked by some people who robbed us.
Oh, my gosh.
Yes, it was. And at the time, I could not express any emotions because I felt I just had to be quiet and hope that it all came out all right, which it did. I lost some money, but that was it.
Mm-hmm.
But afterwards, if I would hear a car backfire or any loud noise, I would immediately freak out and just want to run and hide someplace.
Wow.
And finally, I went into some therapy, and they suggested hypnosis so that I could express the emotions that I could not at the time. And it was in a group, and everyone else in the group was getting PTSD from the description of what happened. But I was able to then say what I felt, and it was an immediate relief.
So, Jane, I'm curious, when you would hear, as you said, like a car backfire, would the details of the traumatic event, the robbery on the bus in Mexico, flood back to you, or were you not even really connecting that?
No, I was, because when this happened, one of the robbers had a gun that he kept pointing at the person's head in front of me.
Oh, my God. Wow.
Yes, and so I always was kind of waiting to hear that gun go off. So I think that's what connected it when I would hear a backfire.
Wow. So, Danielle, there's a lot there. Yes. How common is this, then the loud noise that's associated with the event, and then your mind gets kind of locked into the, replaying the details of the event? Do you hear that a lot?
Yes. Well, first of all, I'm very sorry that happened to you. But yes, that is very common. And the first thing she mentioned is that the symptoms didn't happen right away, and that's not uncommon that they're not going to happen the next day. Sometimes they may not happen until months later. But one of the symptoms of PTSD is that there are triggers. There are stimuli that trigger re-experiencing of the event, such as having a flashback or having nightmares or just very vivid memories, and that can be a smell, a sight, a sound. Mm-hmm. So that is very common, one of the classic PTSD symptoms. And I'm glad that she recognized it and got help when she recognized what it was.
And Colleen, when I described the trigger and then your mind kind of gets locked into the sequence of events, I put medical language to that, but is that in essence what's happening?
That's absolutely what's happening, and there's a very good scientific reason why. So trauma lives in our bodies. So it lives specifically in certain structures of our brain and our nervous system. And the part of the brain, the amygdala, that holds fear, that responds to fear and rage also. But in this situation, fear, it doesn't have the benefit that our frontal lobe does. Our frontal lobe is able to have memory because of the hippocampus. It's a timestamp on memories. There's context when the frontal lobe is involved. But when something traumatic happens and the amygdala takes over, because it's a really, really scary situation, we're not able to understand context, time, place, person. So when we get triggered, that's a really good word to use. When we get triggered in this way, our nervous system kicks on and our amygdala takes over, which means, when this person, I'm sorry, was your name Joe?
Jane, yeah.
Jane. So when Jane hears the car backfire, her amygdala takes over, and she's right back on that bus in Mexico. Her body is pretty much her brain has induced her body to be back in Mexico. She can't recognize, perhaps right at that moment, in that split second that she starts to that her nervous system starts to really freak out, that she's actually safe, that it was just a car backfiring, because the amygdala takes over and all she can experience is the fear that she had on the bus that one day. Does that make sense?
Yes, it really does. Yes. Yeah. Jane, thank you for the call. Danielle, that explains why no amount of, kind of logic override, like I'm safe, I came out of this, really can override an experience of PTSD if you're in that cycle. You can't talk yourself out of this, I guess I'm saying. Is that right?
Yeah, it's like, your body is constantly in that fight or flight mode that we get in when we're in a dangerous situation. You can't get yourself out of that fight or flight. Usually if you're in a dangerous situation, eventually you can calm yourself down, but you're always in this heightened sense of awareness. And it's difficult to get out of it unless you have the help and the know-how to get out of it. You're always on alert and high guard. People will always be hypervigilant, watching their surroundings. They're alert to every sound, every noise, anything that could possibly bring them harm. They are hyper aware of it. And it's a very uncomfortable feeling to live that way.
Ian says on Twitter, my fiance and I were hiking 30 miles in the Wyoming Wind River Range when I had a seizure. She was alone. She had no way to get help outside of leaving me. Whoa. This caused long-lasting PTSD, and a very large ag company she worked for provided no support to get mental health. So, Danielle, why might Ian's fiance have been more susceptible to these symptoms of PTSD?
It's really still being researched as to why some people are more susceptible to PTSD than others, because obviously several people can be in the same traumatic situation. Not everyone in that situation will develop PTSD, but something that we kind of touched on earlier, that layering effect. So a lot of times what happens in your early life can make you more susceptible to getting PTSD later in life. So something called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, people who have history of neglect, trauma, lower socioeconomic status, lower education, things like that make them more susceptible later in life. Women are more susceptible, lack of social support, having pre-existing anxiety and depressive disorders. There are a lot of layers of things that make you more at risk. And without knowing her history, I can't say, but most likely she had other things that made her more at risk for PTSD.
I see. I'm going to read something real quick off of Twitter here. Lauren says, I was a paramedic in St. Louis, Missouri. When I started having PTSD symptoms, I was very reluctant to get help, was already working in a predominantly male field, and admitting to what was going on felt like weakness. Got help on my own EMDR and recommend The Body Keeps Score, which I think is a book that I'm seeing turn up on Twitter. Colleen, this deal of how women might experience the symptoms and then how they might believe they should just tough it out because that's kind of what we do. How can you speak to that?
Oh, gosh, it's a complicated question with a lot of different angles. One of the first things that I think about, though, is, again, anybody who has experienced depression or marginalization is always going to be more likely to blame themselves. The world's been telling them that there are a bunch of negative things, and it differs depending on the group. But basically, the main message is it's your fault. Any hardship you experience is your fault. The world shouldn't change. You need to change. And women are obviously a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this a more patriarchal environment that is what we have in the United States, one that marginalizes women. I think that's absolutely a big piece of this. Possibly one of the biggest. One of the things I was encouraged to hear this woman say, though, is that she really battled against that idea, that she was weak, that she was wrong for experiencing this, and got some EMDR, because EMDR, that's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Mm-hmm.
That's what that stands for. It is one of the key evidence-based treatments to treat trauma, and specifically PTSD and complex PTSD. And so I'm so glad that she did that. I'm hoping that she experienced some success with that.
Danielle, can you, and maybe research doesn't go this far, but it just seems so interesting that eye movement would affect, would influence the way someone experienced post-traumatic stress. So what do you know about why that works or why it helps?
I wish I could explain it very well.
Okay.
I'm not one of the practitioners who does it. I definitely have had patients who do it, and for them it has been a game changer.
Wow.
Honestly, when I refer patients to get EMDR, I have them watch videos about it, because it's really difficult to explain and understand unless you see it happening, because when you explain it to people, are like, well, that doesn't make sense to me. Why does it work?
Yeah.
But the purpose is to, when you're re-experiencing the trauma, to kind of retrain your brain on how it's thinking about the trauma. I said I'm not a practitioner of EMDR, so I'm not the best person to explain it, but I definitely have had patients who have had it, and it really has changed their lives.
Yeah, I am hearing from a number of people on Twitter who do you do it, Colleen, by any chance?
I'm a certified EMDR practitioner.
So what's the link?
So a couple of things. The first is right, exactly. We don't exactly know the exact mechanism. What we know is imperative is bilateral stimulation of the brain. So that means one hemisphere is firing more heavily than the other, and then they alternate. And something about bilateral stimulation of the brain helps people make connections and move through the trauma. Trauma basically in the brain is not encoded like other memories. Like I said, with other more typical memories, both our emotional brain and our animal brain, our human brain, they're all kind of working together. When trauma happens, though, like I said, it's just the amygdala in the back seat. So it doesn't get encoded and filed away the way other memories do. Mm-hmm. It's almost as though a bomb goes off in somebody's head, and the shrapnel is everywhere, which is why people trip over it, right, and get triggered and have all these reactions, because it's not properly filed away. Something about bilateral stimulation, and whether that's using eye movements or audio stimulation or tactile stimulation, something about that bilateral stimulation of the brain helps people make the connections and kind of put things where they belong. Does that? I know it's not a great scientific explanation. We simply don't have it, but does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think for Jerry here, I'm hearing from a number of people on Twitter who say yes, as Jerry does, after years of talk therapy, I was directed to an EMDR therapist. The treatment helped me more in 2 years than anything else. It changed my life. I had PTSD related to childhood isolation, home loss, and my dad's early traumatic death. Let me go to the phones here to Sarah in Minneapolis. Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for waiting. I'm really glad you did.
Oh, yeah. Excuse me. Hi, Carrie.
Hi.
And Beth. Hey, so basically, I was diagnosed with PTSD several years ago. I kind of laughed at it at first, but I was abused. My brother and I were physically, emotionally, and mentally abused from I was 6 until I was 13, and my father was an alcoholic, so he let his girlfriend, just kind of treat my brother and I however she wanted to.
Sarah, that sounds awful.
I grew up thinking it was normal. So when my first son was born, and even before then, throughout college, I had kind of self-medicated with, pretty hard hard substances. I suffered from panic attacks, pretty debilitating panic attacks actually, and nightmares, insomnia, kind of the whole range of symptoms, that you would expect, kind of just reliving the trauma, but not really understanding why or what was going on. So, the first therapist I saw, I did a lot of self-treating with running, helped me manage my symptoms and kind of work through a lot of emotional problems that I was having. And then fairly recently I was prescribed medication to kind of help with a lot of the symptoms, especially the anger, that stemmed from my childhood. And I'm not an angry person, but a lot of self-management techniques kind of weren't working. And, honestly, I've always kind of been against medication, but since I've started taking the medication, I feel like a different person, and I feel like I'm able to process, the trauma. And it was, I'm 32, and I was taken out of the situation when I was 13, but it took me until my late 20s to be able to process what happened to me.
Right.
And then to be able to talk about it. I mean, even a few years ago, I never would have called into the show, even though, I have PTSD, because, I would have maybe been embarrassed. And earlier your guest was talking about triggers how, you're constantly on guard. And I wouldn't say I was constantly on guard, but, if I read a story about, somebody, a kid being abused, or, just little things like somebody yelling, or even a belt coming out, I would get anxious, and I would, my heart rate would increase, and I would get nervous and kind of start looking around like, okay, where's my exit?
Right. Cira, one of the things I want to do is, I think we have not talked about medication at all. So I'm really glad you brought that up. I also want to ask Danielle Johnson about this combination of medication and the exercise that you were doing. Danielle, first on the medications, we hear Cira say, I didn't want to do this. I felt like it was succumbing in some ways to weakness. What do you say to patients about medication and what's out there that's really effective?
So for PTSD and most mental health issues, the combination of psychotherapy and medication can be more effective than either one alone. For some people, depending on the severity of their symptoms, psychotherapy alone can be great. But if the symptoms are severe, a lot of times medication will need to be added. The most effective medication category for PTSD is a class of medication called SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They're the same class of medication used to treat depression and other anxiety disorders. And then particularly for nightmares or re-experiencing, there's a medication called prazosin, which can be taken for nightmares and flashbacks. For people who have panic attacks, we try to avoid medications that can be addictive, like benzodiazepines, because we don't want there, of course, to be an abuse potential, but also we don't want to numb emotions that need to be felt in therapy. We still want people to be able to work through therapy without having emotions dulled. So as far as the exercise that you mentioned, definitely exercise helps with every mental health condition, physical and mental health. So exercise is beneficial, meditation, mindfulness, healthy diet, eliminating use of alcohol and illicit substances. Anything that is good for your body is also good for your mind. So definitely anything that helps calm you, helps relax you, helps distract you, it can be a benefit.
Yeah, Danielle, I didn't want to miss this. I was, in preparation for the show, I was reading some of the Center for Victims of Crime stats about sexual assault, and I know you know how the incidence of sexual assault intersects with race and economic status. So how does that contribute to rising numbers of PTSD among women of color who are victims of sexual assault at a higher rate?
Yes, so in Black women in particular, the rate of sexual assault is about 3.5 times higher than any other group, and a lot of that does have to do with socioeconomic status, and it tends to go underreported or unreported, and because it's not reported, they tend to not get help, and so it's kind of this festering of untreated symptoms, because if you don't talk about it, you're not going to seek help for it. So definitely having a higher incidence of assault and then a higher incidence of it not being treated or reported is going to lead to more symptoms.
Okay.
And if I could,
Colleen,
I
of
could
course.
piggyback off of that for a second, I 100% agree. And I think also we're now seeing this issue that's been more front and center really in the last year, especially with the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, where even when women do report, they're not believed. Yeah. And I don't know what the research says about this, so this is pure speculation. Danielle, if you do, please jump in. But my guess is that, again, marginalized communities and women of color are believed actually less than white
Absolutely.
women, and white women are barely believed when they report. And so it is just such a complicated and a vicious cycle, right? Because
Absolutely.
if this makes me feel terrible and I don't want to talk about it, and I have all of these very clear pictures where even the most privileged white women on the planet are not believed, why on earth would I report?
Yeah, and there's also the added layer of not wanting to, if they're assaulted by a black man, not wanting to get the black man involved in the legal system where we know black men are treated unfairly. So not wanting to burden the black man of being involved with the police and being in prison. So there's that added layer as well.
So on top of the way we know the criminal justice system responds to sexual assault and the fact that many, many women don't report, then it's trying to identify, what's triggering these feelings, and often not being able to get help. Colleen, is that what you're saying for the PTSD? Even if there's been no resolution in the justice system?
Well, and I think they influence one another, right?
Right.
The idea of closure, it can be a little silly and overstated. But if somebody actually went through a criminal justice case where they were believed, where their perpetrator was found guilty and appropriately punished, which, again, almost never happens. Mm-hmm. But in a perfect world, should that all play out the way that it should play out? Might somebody experience some healing from being validated, from feeling like their concerns were taken seriously, like somebody was appropriately punished for what they did? Yeah, I would say that would be a psychologically healthy thing for the survivor, but that doesn't ever happen.
Got it.
And when a woman shuts it down because I can't tell anybody this happened, I'm going to be blamed for it, so I can't talk about it and I can't report it, and they shut it down completely, then there's a 12-step saying that our secrets keep us sick, and that absolutely applies here.
Oh.
Yes.
Call here from Lonnie, listening in northern Minnesota. Hi, Lonnie. Thank you so much for calling in.
Hello. I actually called many years ago in response to a similar program, but my program a long time ago was about birth mothers. And I am 67. I gave birth in 1970 in Minnesota, and that has been a trauma, a secret trauma that has been unacknowledged for many years. Mm-hmm. I did have panic and anger. I listened to your program, and this month now it's like, yes, I am hyper vigilant. And I've gone through a lot of help and have talked with a lot of people. And some of the people I've talked with, how could you have ever done that? And it is about the worst thing you can do is to give up your child. You should die before you do that. And I identify with women all over the world, from Australia to the Sami to the natives who have lost their children. But it is, to me, a post-traumatic stress that I am much better at now, but I do believe that is something I wanted to add to everyone else's various things that we've gone through.
So Lonnie, it sounds like you you experience the judgment of having been forced or having made the decision to give up your child, and that's part of what these triggers of bringing this all up and the difficulty of dealing with the PTSD. Is that what this means all these years later?
That is only one part of it. That was sort of the end part of it.
Mm-hmm.
In those years, the beginning part of it, it was actually physical abuse.
I see.
In the system, how the pregnant girls were treated.
Yeah.
The whole thing was very traumatic, from the school to the hospitals to the doctors to the nurses. The whole system was that way, which is what helped lead to these surrenders. It's like, yes, I give up. But then at the end, yes, but it's not just the judgment. It was the secret that it never happened.
I see.
That had to come first. It was 20 years before. So have you ever had a child? Nope.
Right.
Do you have children? Nope.
Right.
And that's what was part of it. It never happened. It was a secret. And for 20 years, and it was not until Lois Juergens came out in Minnesota, having killed her adoptive child, that I came out. So it's sort of this long process, which I hear other folks speak of as well. But the end is, and now today it's like, well, that was a great thing to do. See, now it's like it never happened again, because people now do open adoptions. And
I mean, the other thing, Lonnie, that occurs to me, and I'll ask Colleen and Danielle to weigh in on this, is how enduring this is. I mean, decades and decades later, Colleen, I think this gives us a sense of the weight of carrying around this trauma for so long. It doesn't just diminish on its own it sounds like for many women.
No, I would say that it doesn't, and I would say that's even more true. So something called complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is not an official diagnosis, but is a cluster of symptoms that Judith Herman introduced in the early 90s that originally was about similar, people who have experienced, who were in Nazi concentration camps and really, really severe things, again, like the more original definition of PTSD. But what we now know about complex PTSD is that you don't need to be in a Nazi concentration camp to experience the symptoms of complex PTSD. And that is exactly what this caller is referring to, just these deaths by a million cuts, a million experiences that all combine and sit on top of one each other and accumulate and make it really, really increasingly more difficult to get out of this set of symptoms without assistance. And so I hear her pain and feel for her. I hope she's able, to get the support she needs.
Danielle, I was reading something, an interview with another psychologist, Cira Kleiman, who also specializes in PTSD. And one of the things she talked about was that PTSD and post-traumatic growth can happen at the same time. I'll just read you something she said. This is the idea that for some people, going through a traumatic event gives them a renewed sense of purpose or meaning in their lives. Do you see that even as you're treating someone for PTSD, coming out on the other side may, infuse them with a sense of purpose, having emerged from it?
Yes, I have seen that happen, especially with sexual trauma. With something so horrendous and so difficult, especially if it happens to someone during their childhood, it's difficult to get through that without finding some meaning or some way to help other people from your experience. So I definitely have had some people, as they're working through their trauma, they want to make sure that this doesn't happen to other children, or they want to make sure that they are able to educate people about this, or they want to just make sure that they protect other people in their family, or for people who have been neglected. They have this strive to protect other children or to protect other women. So not necessarily becoming their life purpose or life goal, but they do have this just strive that I know that I can get through this and I know that I can help other people.
That makes sense. Yeah. Danielle and Colleen, we are a community of readers here, and having seen some book recommendations on Twitter, I wondered if you'd both add to that. What can you read on this to really better understand it? Colleen, book title?
Trauma and Recovery. It's an old one. I don't want to let that deter people.
Okay.
Again, Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman.
All right.
She kind of was groundbreaking in this. I think a lot of the newer stuff is going to fall to Vanderkolk and all these people who get a lot of airtime now. But Judith Herman was really the person who broke open ground in this complex PTSD, that trauma is so much bigger than combat. And so that book is an excellent place to start, whether you're a therapist or not. It really helps people understand that trauma is so much more complicated than a single incident experience.
Colleen, a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you much. And Danielle, a book title for us, if you would.
Actually, I work with a lot of women who have postpartum PTSD.
Okay.
So a book that I recommend is actually called The Fourth Trimester. So it's dealing with getting through postpartum trauma as well as just postpartum period in general. So The Fourth Trimester by Kimberly Ann Johnson.
Danielle, thank you so much for being on the show. Thanks for fielding all the phone calls. Do appreciate it. I'll tweet out the titles of those books, and I really appreciate all of the calls and sharing your experiences on the show today. Thank you.
Thank you.
You just heard a recording of a live radio show on MPR News. To add your voice to the discussion, you can call in at 800-242-2828 or tweet us at CarrieMPR. And if you miss us live, you'll find all our shows by subscribing to this podcast. You can send us your questions or comments by emailing talk@mpr.org.